In this class, we're going to continue our study of classical grammar. We're going to continue the study of substantive nouns, and we're going to focus on the cases of nouns. So a different attribute or characteristic of nouns. In our last lesson, we studied numbers. In the lesson before that, we talked about the different classes of nouns. And in this lesson, lesson 5, we're going to study the cases of nouns. So let's just take a minute, get our notes ready. The title of this class is Classical Grammar. Classical Grammar, and we're in lesson 5. And the subject of lesson 5 is the cases of nouns. The cases of nouns, lesson 5 in classical grammar. Now just to review a little bit, if we go back in our book, let's just back up a few lessons here. In the first lesson, we studied the letters. We learned that there are 26 letters in English. We learned that they divide into vowels and consonants. We learned that some vowels join together to form diphthongs, where two sounds are pronounced together in one syllable. We learned that the letters Y and V can act sometimes as a consonant and sometimes as vowels. We learned that syllables are formed of letters or of individual sounds. We learned that words are formed of syllables and that words are joined together to make sentences. That was lesson 1. In lesson 2, we learned the 10 parts of speech. We learned that in English, there are 10 parts of speech listed. In Latin, there are only 8. In Greek, there are only 8. But in English, there are 10 parts of speech. And we went through them: noun substantive, noun adjective, articles. We learned about participles, verbs, adverbs, just keep moving through, pronouns, prepositions, conjunctions, interjections. We learned that there are 10 parts of speech, and that list of the parts of speech is a table of contents for our study for the rest of grammar. And in lesson 3, we began the study of the first part of speech, which are substantives. We learned what substantives are, and we learned the classes of substantives. We learned that there are common and proper nouns. Then we learned that there are abstract and concrete nouns. And we learned that there are collective nouns, nouns that name a multitude of things. That was lesson 3. In lesson 4, we talked about the number of nouns. We talked about singular and plural number of nouns, that different forms are used to express singular and plural. And we looked at how that works. We looked at the general rule for plural nouns in English, which is that we add S. And then we looked at exceptions to that rule. And we looked at exceptions to the exceptions of the rule. And then we talked about how it's actually very complicated, and sometimes we don't even know if there's a right form. But we go to the writings of men who are considered masters in English, and we look at what they did, and we take that as the standard for the language. And that finished lesson 3, or 4, sorry. And now, in this lesson, we begin lesson 5, which is our third lesson on nouns, okay? So, so far, we're studying the first part of speech, which are substantive nouns. And in the first lesson on nouns, and I'll just put 3 here for lesson 3. In lesson 3, we learned about the division of nouns, or the classes of nouns. In lesson 4, we learned about number in nouns. And now in lesson 5, we're going to learn about cases in nouns. And we'll keep going, studying nouns over the next couple of lessons. All right, so let's get started and read together what our lesson teaches us on the cases of nouns. This is paragraph number 40 in your textbook. Paragraph 40. Paragraph 40 begins, "It is obvious that we think and speak of things that are closely connected with other things." It is obvious that we speak or think and speak of things that are closely connected with other things. We do not conceive everything as standing alone and independent. Remember, substantive nouns are names of things that can stand independently, right? They can stand by themselves. But we don't always think of things separate by themselves. Sometimes different nouns or different things are in close connection. We may think not only of a crown, for example. We may not think of a crown only, but we may think of the king's crown. And we may put these two ideas together, closely connected. We may think of a king's crown, a crown of gold, and so on. So you can see that even though noun substantives can stand alone in speech, we don't necessarily think of them alone or separated from each other. We often join them together and we think of them in close connection. Paragraph 41. When we think of a king's crown, we add to the notion of a crown the notion of its belonging to the king. And that word notion is just another name for idea. So when we think of the king's crown, we add to the idea of a crown the notion or the idea that that crown is belonging to the king. When we think of a crown of gold, we add to the notion or idea of a crown the notion of its being made of gold. So we think of nouns often in close connection. Paragraph 42. We can also think of an action that is done for the benefit of a person. We can think of an action that is done for the benefit of a person. We can think of such an action as being done by such a person, or with such an instrument, or from such a cause. So you can see that we put substantives together and they have different relationships to each other. Paragraph 43. If by a case, and here we have our description, I wouldn't say definition, but a description of a case. If by a case we understand one of the altered forms of nouns by which the various relations of nouns to other ideas may be expressed, the English language has only one case for substantives and two for some of the pronouns. Paragraph 44. Let's just keep reading before we talk about that. But if by the case of a noun we understood the expression of any of these relations, whether indicated by its termination or in any other way, we have as many cases as any other nation or language. All right? So let's take a minute and talk about what we've looked at so far. When we learned about substantive nouns, we learned that when we think, we think of different ideas. And when we speak, we share these ideas, but often we put the ideas together. Right? That's how we think and speak. We put ideas together. And we said that substantives, if one of these ideas is named by a substantive noun, it can stand by itself in speech. But what we're learning in this lesson is sometimes we don't speak with these single, simple, separated ideas. We often join them together in speech so that our speech looks more like this. You see what I mean? We often join words together, so we say AB is C. Okay, we take two ideas, put them together, and we can speak of them. Just because we're referring to a thing and we're using substantive nouns doesn't mean those substantive nouns have to stand completely isolated by themselves. We put substantive nouns together to express different ideas. And the chapter here, the lesson, gave us a list of some different ideas. In paragraph 41, we notice the idea of belonging to or possession. If we said the king's crown, idea A here may be a crown. Idea A may be a crown. Idea C may be the king. And so you can think of the crown and you can think of the king, and these are two separate substantives, but we want to say that these two things are together in this idea we're expressing. We're talking about a crown, but we'd also like to express that this crown is related to the king. It belongs to the king. So this is one relation that we often wish to express using two substantives together. Belonging to. Another relationship we wish to express is that something is made of something else. The crown is gold. The gold crown, we can say. A crown of gold. So we can join together the idea of crown and the idea of gold, and we can put them together to express a more complex idea. The crown of gold, the king's crown. Because when we communicate, we're trying to share ideas, and if I say crown, I don't want you to just to think of whatever idea of crown you might think of. I want you to know that I'm referring to a specific crown. I'm referring to the king's crown. Or I'm referring to a specific kind of crown, a crown made of gold. Right? Other examples of relations we might wish to express, we have a list here. We may wish to express that something is done for the sake of something else, or for the benefit of. We may wish to say that one thing is done by someone else. We may wish to say that something is done with someone else. Okay, and lastly, the last example they give us was from. Something was received or has come from something else. And all of these different ideas or relationships between nouns that help us to communicate a more complex, a clearer image, these different relationships are expressed with substantives in different ways. Okay? So we're not interested in talking like cavemen. We like to articulate complex ideas, and in order to do that, sometimes the way we express complex ideas is by taking the names of those ideas and bringing them together in speech. But to make the language clearer, because we can't just put the things together like this. We can't just say, let's say the crown of the king was stolen. We can't just say crown, that's my first idea, and then king, That's the other idea I'm thinking of. And stolen, that doesn't communicate clearly. Crown, king, stolen. Can you figure out what the person is trying to say? Yeah, you can. But it's just, it leaves it open to possible confusion. And it might not always work. If I said crown, gold, bought. Crown, gold, bought. You see how that's like caveman? It sounds like a caveman speaking, right? Crown, gold, bought. It gets the idea across. The hearer or the reader can figure out what we're probably trying to say, but it's not clear. And we don't want to communicate and leave this much to the hearer or to the reader to figure out. So we want to be able to express this in a way that makes it clearer what the role of these different words are, because it's going to get more confusing as we go on. And so we find that if we take crown, king, stolen, and instead of that we write it as king, and we use this little form apostrophe S, king's crown, stolen, we find that makes this expression much clearer, doesn't it? King's crown stolen. That's much clearer. Or if we say crown of gold bought, using that word of and presenting this as an idea, a crown of gold is bought, it makes our communication clearer. And that's the point. So what we want to know is we want to learn how to use substantives so that we can communicate more complex ideas more clearly. Okay? And what we learn here is that the way we do that is through cases. We do that through cases, through different expressions, by altering nouns, by using the nouns in different ways that allow us to communicate more complex relationships between names when we speak. All right? Let's look back at our text. In paragraph 44, the last paragraph we read, we said, if by the case of a noun we mean the expression of any of these relations between substantives, whether indicated by its termination or in any other way, we have as many cases as any other nation or language. So in other words, in English, we can communicate, we can express in English all of the complex ideas that any other language can. So if anyone says, oh, Greek is much more effective than English because you can express, no, that's not true. Latin is way better than English because you can express, no, that's not true. We can express in English anything that can be expressed in any other language. We simply have to learn how. We have to learn how to express it. All right? So paragraph 45, we begin to learn how to express these things in English. And we see at the top of this paragraph, we see there's a little heading for this subject, and it says nominative case, genitive, accusative. All right, so let's read paragraph 45. The simple form of the noun, the simple, basic form of the noun, which is, of course, used when we consider the noun independently by itself, is called the nominative case. So if you are, like a little toddler, and you're looking and pointing at things, and you're saying, what is that? What is that? What is that? And the answer is simply the name of the thing. That simple, basic form of the noun that you would use to answer the question, what is that? The name of the thing, the name of the substance, that's the nominative case. That's the form that you would look up in a dictionary. All right? If you open an English dictionary and look up a noun, what's written there in the dictionary is the nominative case of the noun. So the first case we learn is the nominative case. All right? And let's keep a list of these. The first case we learn is the nominative case. Just like in Latin, just like in Greek, case allows us to express different ideas, different relationships between substantive nouns. The first case, actually I'll put it over here. The first case is the nominative case. And that's just the simple name. So if I hold this up and I say, what is this? What is this? You're going to tell me the nominative case of this noun, right? Of the name of this thing. So you would say pen, okay? That's the nominative case. Read note A under paragraph 45. The nominative was placed at the head of the cases, though really it is no case. It's not a case. It's just the name. It's merely the word in its unaltered form. So it's really not, it's not perfect to say the nominative case, because it's not a case. It's just the name itself. The word case means fall. The old Greek grammarians wrote the nominative in an upright line, and the other cases they wrote in lines that inclined to it at certain angles. So the forms of the genitive, accusative, and the rest seem to be falling from the original word. Hence, those forms were called the oblique cases. Okay? So that note simply explains where this name nominative comes from and what the word case actually means. It means falling. So just to show you what he's saying, let's take Latin, right? If we take a word like dominus, we might write the noun like this and say that's the nominative case. And then we might write the other forms like this. And it's this idea that this is the regular case, and these other cases are falling away from the regular case. So this really isn't called a case because case means falling. This is just the name itself. And these are the forms that fall away from or are derived from the name. You understand that? And so that idea of these, just writing it out like this and seeing that these forms fall away from the regular case, that fall away idea is what we mean by case. All right? We're just splitting hairs with that. That's not really that important. It's just a note where the author explains what this word case means, where it comes from, right? Paragraph 46. English substantives have only one case, which is formed by inflection. English substantives have only one case, which is formed by inflection. So there's only one case formed by inflection. That means there's only one case that's formed by the changing of the form of the noun. And you have a note there. What does this word inflection mean? Inflectere means to bend inward or to bend. The noun is bent into a fitness to denote the relation to be expressed. So inflection just means the changing or altering of the noun to express the different ideas. We're told the only actual case formed by inflection in English is the genitive. And that's why in paragraph 43, if you go back to paragraph 43, it says, if when we say case, we simply mean the altered forms by which we express various relations of a noun to other ideas. The English language has only one case. So if by case, in Latin, when we say case, we mean altered forms. So in Latin, case refers to all of these different altered forms. But in English, if we use the word case to mean altered forms, there's only one case, and that's the genitive case. Okay? So what we learn there about the genitive case being the only case that's formed by inflection, that's what paragraph 43 is talking about. If by case, when you use the word case, if what you mean by that word is changing the form of the noun to express a relation, if that's what you mean by case, changing the form, then there's only one case, the genitive. And then paragraph 44 says, however, if by case you don't mean changing the form of the noun, but you just mean using the noun to express different relations, well, then there are as many cases of nouns in English as any other language. It depends what you mean by case. If you mean changing the form, there's only one, the genitive. If you mean expressing different relations, then all of those cases exist, okay? So in paragraph 46, where we learn that English substantives have only one case formed by inflection, that's what paragraph 43 is talking about. The genitive case is formed by inflection. We express the idea of the genitive case, which we're going to learn about next. We express the idea of the genitive case by changing the form of nouns, and that's called inflection. All right, so let's go down to paragraph 47. We see we're going to learn about the genitive case. Paragraph 47. The genitive case is now formed by adding s with an apostrophe to the nominative case. The genitive case is formed by adding apostrophe s. Take the nominative form of the noun, add apostrophe s, and that forms the genitive case. And that form, the genitive case, is used to express certain relations. In paragraph 48, we address the question of, well, what happens if we have a plural noun? Do we put apostrophe s after a plural noun that already has an s at the end of it? In plural words ending in s, the genitive is like the nominative, but it is now customary to mark an apostrophe after the s. All right, so the second case we have in English, and I'll put a star next to it because it's the only case formed by inflection, is the genitive case. It's formed by adding apostrophe s to the nominative. So if the nominative form was king, the genitive is formed by taking the nominative plus apostrophe s. So we would have king, apostrophe s. And what paragraph 48 teaches us, if our noun was plural and we had kings, if we had kings, we can put the apostrophe after the s. And that expresses the genitive case in the plural. Okay? Now we see this all the time, and we say this all the time, but what's important about studying grammar is that we actually understand why we say this now, why we read and write this now. That apostrophe s is actually a different form that expresses the idea that we're going to learn about of the genitive case. Okay? So we express the genitive by adding apostrophe s. If the noun is a plural noun that ends in an S, we don't add another apostrophe S, even though when you're little you guys do this. You know how you guys do this? You say Kingses, right? You guys do this, or you have done it when you're growing up. Kingses, right? That's not right. We don't do that. We don't add apostrophe S after S. We add apostrophe S after a singular. And if it's a plural and it ends in an S, then we just put an apostrophe after that final S. We don't say kingses. We don't repeat the S. We just use that S. Kings. So what's important to see there is when you speak it, you wouldn't know it was different. You'd only know that it's genitive if you write it. Okay? So if I said, we collected the king's crowns, if I spoke that, you wouldn't know that it's genitive except by the idea that it communicates. You would only know that that's a genitive when you saw it written by seeing the apostrophe after it. Do you understand that? When we actually say it, there's no difference. If I said kings is nominative, the genitive would be kings. But in writing, there would be an apostrophe at the end. But we wouldn't know that in speech. All right, so that's the genitive case. Apostrophe S, unless it's a plural noun that ends in S, then we put the apostrophe after the S. Let's keep reading. So in the phrase, now what we do in grammar, normally we learn a rule and then we learn exceptions to the rule. Sit up. This is work time. This isn't television. This is your work. This isn't television. In the phrase, for righteousness' sake, what we see in grammar is we learn a rule, and the rule covers most situations. But then there are exceptions, and we study the exceptions. The rule covers almost everything, and we spend our time learning the exceptions. So here we have a couple of notes. We have the general rule that to form the genitive, you simply add apostrophe S. If there's a plural noun that ends in S, you just add an apostrophe at the end of the noun to show the genitive case. Note A, in the phrase, for righteousness' sake, for righteousness apostrophe sake. But in speech, you wouldn't know that there's an apostrophe there. That's the point, okay? And so sometimes people just write it without the apostrophe because we don't speak the apostrophe anyway. We say, for righteousness' sake. We don't say, for righteousness' sake. Note B, the apostrophe after the general plural is absurd. For an apostrophe marks that a vowel has been dropped, whereas no vowel ever followed the S of the plural to form a genitive. So one grammarian argues that putting an apostrophe after an S makes no sense, and we shouldn't even do it. So this is an example where there's disagreement on how we should express that, but because we're used to it, remember this is also about usage, because we're used to that, putting an apostrophe after an S, people understand what that means. If you're writing, it matters. If you're speaking, it doesn't matter anyway, so it's not a big deal. Okay? So the first case is the genitive, the only case we have that's actually formed by changing the form of the word. We're going to skip note C. You can, if you're interested in these little historical notes that they add, you can read them. Sometimes they're just trivia and they really don't help us at all. C and D we're going to skip and get down to note, paragraph 49. All right, paragraph 49. When two or more words are so closely joined together as almost to form one complex notion or idea, the sign of the genitive is added to the last word so as to put the whole phrase in the genitive. All right, so what this talks about is if we want to express possession, the genitive case expresses possession, right? The king's crown expresses the idea that the crown belongs to the king. But what happens if we have a more complex idea that we'd like to express? For we can say the king's crown, and this is pretty simple. Right? Here's our noun. Here's our noun. It expresses that the crown belongs to the king. That's what the genitive can express, right? It expresses possession, the king's crown. But this is simple. This is a simple idea we're thinking of. What if it was much more complicated than that? And he gives us some examples there in paragraph 49. What if we wanted to say the King of England's crown? So what if our idea is more complex? This whole entire expression is in the genitive case. This whole entire expression expresses to whom the crown belongs, or of whom, or of whose the crown is. You got that? This whole expression is the genitive case. So what do we do when we have a complex phrase? The rule says when two or more words are so closely joined as almost to form one complex idea. So by the King of England, we really are just referring to one idea, one complex idea. The sign of the genitive is added to the last word. You got that? So as to put the whole phrase in the genitive case. And in speech, we often struggle to know what to say in these cases when we want to express these ideas. Like let's say two of you, Isaiah and Daniel, right? Let's say you share a bike, and I want to refer to that bike. So what do I say? I say, can you put Isaiah and Daniel, so these are ideas, bike. But I want to express the genitive. I want to show that the bike belongs to Isaiah and Daniel. Do I write Isaiah and Daniel's bike? Or do I write Isaiah's and Daniel's bike? Which one is right? Do I say, go put Isaiah's and Daniel's bike away? Or do I say, go put Isaiah and Daniel's bike away? Yeah, so the rule tells us we should treat this whole entire thing as one idea and just put an apostrophe S at the end. And what that means is that this whole idea is the genitive. But you can see how that gets confusing. And you'll find expressions in English where it's kind of clumsy. Like let's say it's not Isaiah and Daniel's. Let's say it's my car and mom's car. Now express that idea. That's much more difficult, right? And we get into these awkward expressions all the time. Mom and me, mom and I. If I say, can you wash mom and me's car? Mom and I's car? You see how that's very awkward? Or we say, can you go wash mom's and my car? You see that expression is clumsy, right? It's hard to figure out what we should say. So what do you think we should say? You think we should say mom and I's car? Mom and I's car? That's what the rule says, right? Mom and I is the complex subject. Mom and I's car, right? Or should I say mom and my car? Mom's and my car? You see what I mean? How that phrase gets really tricky and difficult. So that's the kind of situation that the author is talking about there in paragraph 49. We get into some tricky expressions where we have a complex idea we're trying to express, and it's hard for us to figure out how to articulate that when I'm talking about the car and I want to add another noun to it to clarify and explain some relation or more detail about the car, sometimes these expressions can get confusing. Mom and I's car? Can you wash Mom and I's car? Can you wash Mom's and my car? All right? What would the answer be? Think about it. That's Article 49. There are some expressions where we have a more complex idea where it makes the genitive difficult to express, but the rule is that you should express that complex idea and put the apostrophe S after the last noun. That's the rule. All right? But we can see there are confusing situations, and we just have to think through them and work them out. Right? That's Article 49. Let's keep going. In Article 50, we move on to the next case, which is the accusative case. So we have another case. We'll add that to our list up here. The accusative case. Why did I put a star next to the genitive case? I'm not putting a star next to the accusative case. What's the difference? Why did I put a star here? Remember what that star meant? Remember? There's something special about the genitive case? No. The genitive case is the only case that actually changes the form of the noun. Okay? The genitive case, by adding the apostrophe S, the genitive case is the only case that actually changes the form. There are other cases, but the other cases just express relations. They don't actually change the form of the noun. The next case is the accusative case. Article 50. Article 50. We're about 45 minutes. Is that right? 43 minutes? Good. The accusative case. We read, the suffering object. The suffering object. And remember, suffering doesn't mean to be in pain when it's used like this. Suffering doesn't mean the object is sick and in bed suffering. That's not what it means. It just means receiving action. Okay? All right? So if I wash the car, if the car is washed by me, the car is the object, right? I wash, that's the action, and the car receives the action. The car suffers the action. That's what that word suffers means. All right? Suffers in this context in grammar, it doesn't mean suffering like crying in pain. It just means to receive the action of the verb. The suffering object, the object that receives the action of a verb. The object immediately or directly affected by the action expressed by the verb stands in the accusative case. So the accusative case is used to express what's called the direct object of the verb. The accusative case is used to show that the noun is the direct object of the action of the verb. In elementary grammar, you learned about transitive verbs, right? Transitive verbs, remember that? Transitive verbs are verbs where the action of the verb requires an object. That idea is what we're talking about here, right? I kick the ball. The ball is the direct object. The action of kicking goes directly onto the ball, is suffered directly by the ball. If I say, I kick the ball to Joshua, is Joshua directly affected by the verb? No. He's indirectly affected. I kick the ball is directly affected by the verb kick. And then Joshua is indirectly affected by kicking because the ball goes to him. You see that? All right? I kick the ball is a direct object, the immediate object that suffers the action of the verb. But then there can be other objects that are called indirect objects because they're affected by that action, but not directly. Only the ball is affected directly. Okay? The suffering object, that is, the object immediately affected or directly affected by the action expressed by the verb, stands in the accusative case. Okay, that's the accusative case. So just to make this clear, let's look at an example. And remember, in English, the accusative case doesn't change the form of the noun. And this is what can actually cause English to become confusing. And we have to learn to be careful that we don't write confusing sentences because the cases don't have different forms. And if we don't write clearly, someone can read what we write and not know which word is the nominative and which word is the accusative, right? So if I give something simple like God created the world. God created the world. What case is God? What case? We've learned 3 so far. Nominative, genitive, and accusative. What case is God? It's the subject of the verb. It's the nominative case. We're simply naming the subject, God. God what? Then we name a verb, and we haven't studied verbs yet. We name the verb. God did something. God acted. He did something. He created. And the act of creation, the action of creation passed directly onto the world, right? So what case is world in? Accusative case. Okay? So we see our nominative, which is the simple noun, the simple name. We're just naming the subject we're talking about. But we then have another noun. We have another noun, but we have to make it clear that this is not the subject. Because I could write something like this. I could change the word order, and it still communicates the same idea. Watch this. Ready? God, the world, created. God, the world, created. Does that make sense? Yes, it makes sense, right? Because you know what I'm saying. You already know what I'm saying. God, and I would read it in a certain way or say it in a certain way, my expression would reveal the relations between the nouns. God, the world, created. You understand what that means, but it's because you already know it. But I could also say the world, God, created. And that can express the same idea. The world, God created. Right? But of these three, which is the clearest? Which one? The top one is the clearest, right? This is the best. Why? Because the word order helps us to understand what's what. In English, we rely on the order of the words. That's how we make these things clear, because the forms don't change. Whereas in Latin, we wouldn't have this problem, because God would be Deus, right? And world would not be mundus. It would not be mundus. We would change the form to mundum. And mundum would tell us that it's the accusative case. And if we move the words around in order, it wouldn't be confusing, because the cases, the forms would be different. Do you understand that? That's why in Latin, word order is not that important, because we don't rely on word order to understand what's going on. We can see the relationship between the words because of their forms. But in English, the accusative case doesn't change its form. And that can lead to confusion. So we rely on word order. Word order in English is how we actually make it clear what the subject is. Because when we say something, we say the subject first, right? Right? We say God, the subject, then the verb, created, and then after the verb, we say the object, the world. Word order in English is how we make it clear who the subject is and what the object is. We do that in English by word order. In other languages where the cases all change their forms, word order is not that important, because we can look at the forms of the words. Okay? So all three of these are acceptable English sentences, and there may be times in your writing where one of these is better than the other. For example, if you're writing poetry and you're trying to rhyme the ends of lines, moving words around allows you to get a certain word at the end of the line and use it to rhyme. You understand that? So if the last line ended with related, I wouldn't want to say God created the world. I would want to say God the world created. And that would allow me to rhyme with related. You see what I mean? So moving words around in poetry is sometimes helpful for the sake of rhyming and rhythm. But poetry creates less clear expressions. All right? In English, we start with the subject, then the verb, then the object. That's usually how we identify the accusative case. Let's go back to our text. The suffering object, that is, the object immediately affected by the action expressed by the verb, stands in the accusative case. Verbs that take an accusative case, or in other words, verbs that express an action done to an object are called transitive verbs. Transitive verbs. The accusative case, therefore, assigns the immediate object affected by the action in answer to the question whom or what. He struck Richard. Whom did he strike? Richard. The answer to the question whom or what is the accusative case. And then lastly, paragraph 51, we read, in English substantives, the nominative and accusative are alike. In English substantives, the nominative and accusative are alike. That's a possible cause of confusion. And we're going to see in your writing, you're going to see that you often get yelled at because you don't make your nominatives and accusatives clear in your writing, and it can lead to confusion, right? But in personal pronouns, the accusative is formed by inflection, and we're obviously going to learn this more later on, but the author just wants us to see that with personal pronouns, we actually do change the form to express the accusative. So if we say, John struck Peter, and we say, Peter struck John, the forms don't change. The word order tells you who struck whom, right? If I say, John struck Peter, you say, okay, John was the one who acted, and Peter was the object. But then if I say, Peter struck John, you say, oh, okay, Peter performed the action, and John received the action. And how do you know that? By word order, right? We put the subject first and the object after the verb. But in pronouns, it's different. In pronouns, if I say, I struck John, I use the form I in the nominative case. I'm the subject. I struck John. But if John was the subject and I was the object, I don't say, John struck I. I change the form to the accusative, which is me. Me is the accusative form of I. Do you understand that? You understand that? Me is the accusative form of the pronoun I. So when you have to decide, some people will say, you should never, you should be careful with using I. And I mean, it's because there are cases in pronouns. All right? So that's all. That last note just tells us that while substantives are the same in the nominative and accusative case, personal pronouns do change to express these different ideas. So if you're using a pronoun, remember that the different forms like I and me, he and him, she and her, they express the different ideas of the different cases. And that's why they change. You'll see like a little child like Anna will say, Mom said she wants she purse. You see what I mean? And the little ones don't understand that she and her are two different cases for that pronoun. So we'll learn that when we study pronouns. But that's all for this lesson on cases of nouns. We see that we've learned that there is a nominative case that expresses the simple name. There's a genitive case that expresses possession. And there's an accusative case that identifies the direct object. The accusative case does not change the form of the nominative. The accusative case is normally recognized by either word order or because we simply know the context of what we're reading and we know what it's talking about already and we know that that's the subject and that's the object. All right? The genitive case, though, does change the form of a noun. But you might ask, in the opening of this chapter, we said that there are a bunch of different relationships. We said in, with, from, by, on account of. Remember all that we listed? Well, we didn't learn that. What about those cases? What about all those other relations that he mentioned at the beginning of the chapter? This is what makes English different. In English, we don't use different forms. We use prepositional phrases. Okay? So I would say, I, or my house is in North Carolina. In is a preposition, and in order to express the idea of location, I use a preposition and a noun. Right? If I said, I worked with Tom, I use a preposition to express that idea with Tom, right? We have, or I could say, let me just make it clearer. Frank worked with Tom, we have two nouns. To express the relationship between those two nouns, we use a preposition with. We use a preposition in. We use a preposition from, for, to, and so on. In English, we use prepositions for everything. Where in Latin, we could express this just by changing the case of the noun, just by changing the form. We wouldn't write with, we could just change the form, right? But in English, we express these other relations with prepositions. So we haven't studied that yet, but that's how that works. All right? So that's all for lesson 5. Make sure you know the topic is cases of nouns. What are cases? Cases are different forms of the noun or different uses of the noun to express relations between substantives in a sentence. Cases are forms of nouns or expressions used to express complex ideas, relationships between substantives in speech. Okay, that's lesson 5 on cases. Take a minute, write a summary of what we've studied in this class, and that's going to be all, for now at least, all for now, for cases of nouns.